Hello, and welcome to the Mac Academy video training tape series. On this particular tape, we're going to go through the basic setup and operations of the Macintosh computer. We're going to go through the pieces of a Macintosh, how to hook them together and get started with them. Then we'll go through the basic operations of operating the Macintosh, using the software, and all of the basic functions to the Macintosh that are familiar and common to most all of the Macintosh programs. What we need to do first is identify the different pieces of the Macintosh. First of all, of course, is the Macintosh itself. The smaller Macintosh models includes the computer and the processor all together in one place. The other pieces that we need to hook together are the Macintosh mouse. You should have a mouse with your Macintosh. This is what we use to operate most of the functions on the Macintosh rather than type them in from the keyboard. It comes with the cable attached to it as part of it. We also do need a keyboard on the Macintosh so that we can enter text data, and if you prefer the keyboard rather than the mouse, a lot of the operations can be executed from the keyboard. There are a couple of models of keyboard. They're not packaged with the Macintosh anymore, so you do need to purchase those separately. Along with the keyboard will be a keyboard cable or cord so that you can hook the Macintosh into the computer, and we'll do that in just a minute so that we can be operational. You do need a power cord that should have come with the Macintosh so that you can plug it into the outlet and have power to operate the computer. Along the lines of power, one thing I do recommend is that you get a good surge protector of one brand or another so that you can plug this between the computer and the wall and protect the computer circuitry should you have a power surge or a spike in your power lines. It's a good idea to keep those plugged in all the time. What we want to do first is take a look at the ports on the back of the Macintosh so that we can identify each of them and what they do, so that we can take a look at how to hook the computer up, and they may be laid out a little differently for each of the different Macintoshes, but all of the same ports are there. On this side we have two ports. These are called the Apple Desktop Bus, or more commonly called ADB ports. These are the ports where we hook in the keyboard and the mouse cords. They can hook into either one. You'll see an icon right above them that matches the icon on the end of the keyboard cords, the end of the mouse cord, and that's on either end of the keyboard. Right next to there we have a disk drive port for an external floppy disk drive. You'll notice a little icon above that that has the look of a floppy disk drive, and that's where an external floppy disk drive would be hooked onto the computer. The Macintosh 2 did not have this particular port. Most of the others do. If we move across one more, we see one that's called the SCSI port. It's SCSI. That stands for Small Computer Systems Interface. It's commonly referred to in the computer industry as a SCSI port. This is used to attach up to 6 different devices to your Macintosh as other hard drives, external hard drives, scanners, some printers, a lot of different devices hook onto this what's called the SCSI port, SCSI. And then next to that we have 2 other ports on the Macintosh. One of them has the little icon of a printer above it. This is the port that's used to plug the printer cable in. Right next to that there is one that has a little picture or icon of a telephone above it, and this is used to plug a modem in if you had a modem to hook onto your Macintosh. Either one of these ports can be used for a modem or a printer. If you have a laser printer, however, it must be hooked into the one with the printer icon above it. Right next to those there is a little small jack where you can put an external speaker to play the sounds out of the Macintosh. Directly above those 2 ports you'll see the outlet for the power cord, where you plug the Macintosh in, and right next to that the power switch. One caution with the power switch is before you hook anything to the Macintosh, make sure it is turned off when plugging or disconnecting anything from the other ports. Make sure the power switch is off or in the down position. Right over here across to the other side, above the Apple Desktop Bus ports, most computers of the SE variety have a panel across here. This can be removed, as you can see here, and it does expose where the expansion slot is on the Macintosh. So if you add some external monitors, other output devices, a variety of options for the SE, it shows up in the back here by removing the plate, as is done on this one. Okay, let's go ahead at this point and hook the different items together using the ports on the back. If we take the mouse, if you match the icons, it's pretty easy to do. You can take the one, make sure that the flat part is to the top, and you can plug the mouse in either one of those 2. You can take the keyboard connector, again making sure the icons match and the flat part is to the top, and you can plug the keyboard into the other one. Then you take the other keyboard, take the other end of the keyboard cable, and on either end of that you'll find an icon that matches Simply match the icons and plug the keyboard in with the other end of the cable. Now, if you prefer, you can take the mouse and plug it to the other end of the keyboard if that helps it lay out on your desktop a little bit better. Let's go ahead and take the power cord. We'll plug that into the power cord outlet, again making sure the switch is off or in the down position before you do. Plug the other end of the surge protector and then the power outlet, and we're ready to set up and start operating the Macintosh. Now that we have the Macintosh all set up, we're going to start learning the basic operations on the Macintosh itself. The first thing we'll use is what's called a floppy disk. This is a floppy disk. They use the 3.5-inch floppy disks on the Macintosh. These are where the files are stored that you store your information on or that come with the Macintosh in order to operate. There are 4 disks that come with your Macintosh called System Tools, Printing Tools, Utilities Disk 1, and Utilities Disk 2. These are the programs that you need to operate the Macintosh and contain the programs provided by Apple. There's also what is called a hard disk drive. The hard disk drive in some cases is built inside of the computer. In others it may be added on extra. In this particular one it's built right inside of the Macintosh. If it's already been installed by someone else, then some of those files from the System Tools may already be there and your Macintosh will be operational. In order to get started, we need to learn some of the basic operations, so we're going to take the floppy disk called System Tools and we will start up our Macintosh with that disk. The term startup means that it will start up and run the computer. To do so, we need to turn the Macintosh on with the power switch in the back, and as the screen lights up, what you'll notice on the screen is the flashing question mark. The flashing question mark, if there's no disk with instructions that tell the Macintosh what to do on it in the computer anywhere, it isn't sure what to do, and so it gives you the question mark letting you know it's waiting for other instructions. We're going to take the floppy disk called System Tools. We're going to put that in the computer. Do so with the label facing up and the metal part into the computer first. That'll be the instructions the computer's waiting for. If we push it in, you'll hear it snap into the drive. If all is well, you'll see the smiley Macintosh on the screen and then the Welcome to Macintosh message. The computer has run some checks and gives you those messages to let you know everything is okay, and it is loading the programs into its memory so that we can start to utilize the Macintosh. It takes a few seconds to load all of those instructions into its memory, and the message stays on the screen. Once it is loaded, we will see what is called the desktop on the Macintosh. Usually it has a gray pattern, as you can see. There will also be some pictures on the screen. On the Macintosh, those are called icons. We use the icons or pictures of items on the Macintosh in order to execute a lot of the commands and to work with the Macintosh. Whenever you see the trash can, the icon down here in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, that is what we call being in the Finder. When you see the trash can there, that means we are in a program called the Finder, which creates the desktop. It's also called being in the desktop on the Macintosh. Now what we need to do is learn the basic Macintosh operations called point, click, and drag. We also need to remember one basic Macintosh rule when we're using the Macintosh, and that rule says we select something and then we do something to it. So remember that in nearly all of the operations on the Macintosh, we select something. Once we've selected an item to let the computer know what we want to work on, then we tell the computer what we want to do to that particular item. So that's called selecting an item. So you select something, then you do something to it. That's the basic Macintosh rule. The way that we do that is the first operation on the Macintosh called point. Now as you notice, if you put your hand on the mouse and move it around on a table or a smooth surface, that you'll see the cursor on the screen move around in conjunction with that. If you move the mouse left or right, the little cursor or the arrow on the screen moves left or right. If you move the mouse up or down, the arrow on the screen moves up or down proportionately. So as you move the mouse around on the table, you can point to different items on the desktop in the Macintosh. Now the word point on the Macintosh is a little bit misleading, because when we say point, what we really mean is take the very tip of the arrow and place it on top of something. In this case, place it on top of that icon that looks like a manila folder with the word System Folder underneath. To point to something, you place the tip of the arrow on top of that. When we click one time, you'll notice that it becomes selected or highlighted, and the color changes to black to let you know that that's been clicked on, and then we do something with that. You can select another item by moving the cursor over that item, in this case the folder called Setup Folder. Click one time, and you'll see it become selected. That would tell the computer anything we want to do now will happen to that particular item. You notice as we selected the Setup Folder icon, that the system folder icon became deselected or back to the normal color. If you click on any other icon or picture, you'll see its icon become selected or highlighted. You'll see the other one become deselected. So we typically select one item at a time. So that's called pointing. We point, we put the tip of the cursor over something. When you click, that means you push the button on the top of the mouse down one time. That's called clicking. Now we need to learn about dragging. Dragging is what we use to activate the menus on the Macintosh where most of the commands reside in most of the Macintosh programs. When we talk about dragging, let's move the pointer over the word file. Now to point at the word file, that means we put the tip of the mouse button right on top of the word file. Push the mouse button down one time, that's called clicking. Now you notice when we click that time though, that a little menu appeared and disappeared so quickly you may not have even noticed it. So we're going to learn dragging. To drag, you point at the item you want, which means put the tip of the cursor on top of it, push the mouse button down and hold it in this case. You'll notice that a menu drops down from the top of the screen under the word called File. These are called pull-down menus on the Macintosh. They drop down like a little window shade, and there are a series of instructions on those. If you continue to hold the mouse button down, the menu stays open. As soon as you let go of the mouse button, the menu will disappear or close. If you push the mouse button down again while it's over the word File, the menu drops open. As long as you hold it down, it stays open. Now while holding the mouse button down, slowly drag the cursor down the screen and you'll see it move across the different words. When it moves across one of the commands that is available, it highlights or becomes selected, and then if we let the mouse button up, the computer would execute that command. If you move down to another command, the one prior becomes deselected and the next one becomes selected. So we can execute any of the commands by pointing to the one we want. You notice some of them are gray and they do not highlight as you move the cursor across them. That means that this command is not available at this time, and so it won't allow you to execute that. And we can continue to move down and select any of the items that we want to do. First one we want to work with is called Open. Let's select the Open. Now as you can see, the folder called Setup is the one that is presently selected or highlighted. That means we've told the computer we want to do something with the Setup folder. Now we've gone to the File menu and clicked and dragged down to the word Open, which tells the computer we want to open the folder called Setup. When you release the mouse button, it activates the command and you'll see the window open on the Macintosh, and it contains other icons that were inside of the folder called Setup. You can see its name right there on the screen. These are called windows on the Macintosh, and everything appears in windows. With the windows we can see the icons and we can organize our files in different windows. Now you'll notice behind this window called Setup folder, there was the window we saw originally on the screen called System Tools. When the Setup window opened and became the one in front, you can see horizontal bars along the title. This is called the title bar. The one that's in front is called the active window. That means all the commands that we would execute and utilize happen in the active window. You notice the one called System Tools behind, the horizontal bars in the title area have disappeared. So all we see is the name of the window. If we're to move the cursor over that other window and click one time, you'll notice this window called System Tools comes to the front. The horizontal title bars appear back in the window. That is now the active window, and it is in front of the window for the Setup folder. Notice the Setup folder's icon is gray. That means that that window is open. And if you look down across the bottom of the System Tools window, you can see part of that window showing. It is behind the one called System Tools. Now there's another way to bring a window to the front, and again it's accomplished by clicking. In this case, if we can click on any part of the window that shows, down here on the bottom we'll click on the part of the window from the Setup folder. You'll notice the Setup folder window comes back to the front with the horizontal bars in the title. The System Tools window now moves behind it and the horizontal bars disappear. If we click back anywhere on the window, System Tools, it comes back to the front, the horizontal bars appear, and the other window moves to the back. There is another way to bring it to the front, and that introduces one of the shortcuts to a lot of the operations on the Macintosh, and that is called double clicking. That means you click twice quickly on the mouse button. If we move across the grayed icon called Setup Folder, that tells us the window is open. We can bring it to the front by placing the cursor on top of it and double-clicking. Twice quickly, the computer interprets that as a double click rather than two separate clicks, and it brings that window back to the front. So we can move through the windows by clicking on them and bring any one to the front. We can also move windows around on the Macintosh by clicking in the title bar. Now if we click anywhere on the horizontal lines and hold the mouse button down, we can move the window. You'll notice an outline moves with it, and as you move the mouse button you can move it anywhere on the screen that you would like, so that we can reposition the windows to suit our purposes better if you'd like to. If we click on the one called System Tools, it comes to the front. Click and hold the mouse button down on the horizontal bars in the title area, drag the mouse, and you'll notice the window moves and remains where it's repositioned. So you can move things around by clicking and dragging. We can select menu items by clicking, dragging down to the item that we want. In this case, let's select Close. Now with what we've learned so far, the window that is active is the System Tools window. That's the same as if it were selected, meaning that all the menu commands will work on the active window. One of the options we could accomplish with that window is to close it. So if we drag down to the Close command and release the mouse button, it closes the window called System Tools, and it returns to its icon, which is an icon of the disk called the System Tools disk. If we click anywhere on the gray area, that deselects everything, and so now nothing is selected. There are some other ways to close windows. One of them is called the Close box. Rather than go to the menu and execute the Close command, we can go into the title area. In the upper left-hand corner of the title bar, there is a square box. If you click inside that box, meaning placing the very tip of the cursor inside the box, click one time, that's the Close box. That now closed that window and returned it to the disk where it was. We can open windows by double-clicking. That means we would click twice quickly. Let's click in the gray title area so that everything is deselected. Move the cursor across the disk icon. You'll notice this icon looks like the floppy disk that we inserted in the computer. That's to tell you what that is. The disk is called System Tools. It is a floppy disk, as its icon shows, and right now that contains the files that are operating the computer. If you double-click, that's click twice quickly with the mouse button on the icon, that opens the window to the System Tools disk, just the same as having gone to the menu and selected the Open command. So you can accomplish a great many things on the Macintosh by double-clicking. I recommend you spend some time on the Macintosh learning point, click, and drag until you get very comfortable with the mouse. We can drag down to menu items and select commands, as you've seen so far. We can also drag windows around on the desktop by clicking in their title bar and moving them around to other positions. We can also move icons. If we click on the Setup Folder icon, hold the mouse button down, and drag, you can see that its icon moves to a different place on the screen. The outline goes with it. Let's drag it again. You can see the little outline go with it with the cursor so that you can see where it's going to be placed. It remains on the desktop where it was until you let the mouse button up. When we let the button up, then it moves the item to its new position on the screen. So you can drag icons around on the screen as you start to organize your desktop. You can drag windows around on the screen, and you can select items by dragging down to different commands on the menu. In this case, the Close command would then close that window for the System Tools disk. Clicking on the gray area deselects everything, and now very few of the commands are available to us because there's nothing selected to tell the computer what to execute that command on. So we need to be very comfortable with the functions called point, click, and drag. Let's open the System Tools window again. Double-clicking is the shortcut. That opens the System Tools window where we can see all of the icons inside of that window. Now, as we've learned already, you can click on an item one time and that selects it to tell the computer we'd like to do something to that item. We can click on another item that deselects the first item and selects the next item that we click on. And that process continues. There are times, however, when we might like to select more than one item at a time. There are several ways to accomplish that, or select what's called multiple items, or do what's called a multiple selection. One of them is holding down the Shift key on the keyboard. It's the one on either side called Shift that we use to accomplish capital letters when we're typing. With one item selected, hold down the Shift key. Now click on another item. You'll notice that it becomes selected. The prior item also stays selected. If we continue to click on different icons, they all remain selected as long as the Shift key is held down, and we can select multiple items by holding down the Shift key. If we click on any one of those items while the Shift key is still held down, it deselects that one item, but it does not affect any of the other selections. If we click on the Setup folder again, it becomes selected with holding the Shift key down. If I let the Shift key up and click on the Setup folder, nothing happens because all four of the items are still selected, and that's just telling the computer we want to select something that's already selected. If we click anywhere in the window area or anywhere in the gray area, that deselects everything. So let's do that one more time. Hold down the Shift key, click on the System folder. While holding the Shift key, click on the Setup folder. Holding the Shift key again, we'll click on Teach Text. We'll click on an icon called README, and we can select multiple items. Holding down the Shift key, we can deselect different parts of that without affecting the others. Click in the gray area, that deselects everything. There's another way to select multiple items that you'll get very comfortable with after a while. That's called the selection rectangle. This time, when we're in the window area where the icons reside, rather than clicking on any one of the icons, we move the cursor off into the white area, just off of one of the icons, hold the mouse button down, click and hold it down. As we do, we drag the mouse button. You'll see an outline, a rectangular box from the point where we first clicked until we'd stop and let the mouse button up. Anything, any icon that rectangle touches will become selected. If we surround the System folder, it becomes selected, but nothing else does. Let's click in the window area and deselect that. Now let's click in the window area, hold the mouse button down. This time we'll drag the selection rectangle till it touches two items. I won't completely surround the item called Teach Text. I'll just touch it partway through and let the mouse button up. It selects both of the items. If we click in the area, window area again, off of the icons, they're deselected. Hold the mouse button down. We'll drag a large enough rectangle to surround all four icons that we see on the screen in the window, and let the mouse button up. That selects all four of the items. So we can select them by using the selection rectangle. Click in the window area, it deselects everything. Okay, let's walk through the steps again very quickly. Point means we put the cursor on top of something. Click means we click the mouse button one time. In this case, with it on top of an icon, it selects that icon. If we click to a menu item, we hold the mouse button down and the menu stays open. While the mouse button is held down, we drag down the different menus till we select the option that we want to have happen for the item that was selected. If the mouse button is continued to be held down and we move off of the menu, you'll notice no items are selected, and if you let up the mouse button, it simply closes the menu without executing a command. So if you ever open a menu and was the wrong one, or the command you wanted isn't there, or for some reason you've changed your mind, simply move the cursor off of the menu, nothing is selected, let the mouse button up, and it closes the menu without executing any of the commands that were there. Dragging for icons means we click on them to select them, hold the mouse button down, and we can drag the icon and reposition it on the screen as we move items around. So we can drag items around by just clicking and dragging. So we've got point, click, and drag. Those are the basic Macintosh operations you want to be very familiar with and very comfortable with. The better you understand the basics on the Macintosh, the more proficient you become in the other programs, because they all work very similar. So I would spend some time clicking, pointing, and dragging and getting comfortable moving those icons around on the screen. As we've seen, we can move the windows around on the screen, but in many cases we want to change the size of the windows. There are several ways that we can accomplish that on the Macintosh. In the gray title bar, not the gray title area, but the title bar where the gray lines appear, the horizontal lines, we've used the close box in the upper left-hand corner to close the window. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a square box with another box inside of it. That's called the zoom box. If you click in the zoom box one time, the window zooms out to almost the entire screen size so that we might be able to display more items than we could see with the window in its present size. If you click in the zoom box again one time, that zooms back to the size it was before you zoomed it out, and it returns it to that size. So we can use the zoom box. Click one time, zooms it out to full screen size other than an area to show different icons, and click again, it zooms back to the size it was before. There are other ways to size the window. In the lower right-hand corner of the window, you'll see a square where it looks like one square on top of a larger square. If you put the mouse button in that corner, that means the tip of the cursor inside of the square. Click the mouse button down and hold it. As you move the mouse, you'll notice an outline of gray dotted lines moves to show you the size the window would be if you let go of the mouse button at that point. We let go of the mouse button, the window drops to that size, and we have resized the window. Click in the corner again, we can drag the window vertical or horizontal and adjust its size to any size that we would like it to be on the screen to better organize our files or to view the information that's there. You'll notice if I shrink this down, I'm going to change horizontally so that it's a little shorter and cover up some of the icons on the bottom of the window by using the size box that we just used. That's called the size box on the window. Let the mouse button up. Now the window is a smaller size. We cannot see all of the items that are there. Looking across the bottom of the window, you can see there's part of the icons, but we can't see enough of the icon to identify what it is. That allows us to use what's called the scroll bars on the windows. There's one vertical on the right-hand side of the window, and there is one horizontal across the bottom of the windows. All of these activities for point, clicking, dragging, sizing windows applies to all of the Macintosh programs. They all work the same way. You'll notice in the scroll bar, now it's gray on the vertical side. There is an arrow at the top pointing up, an arrow at the bottom pointing down towards the size box, and there is a white box inside of the scroll bar, and the gray area is filled in. If we look at the scroll bar across the bottom, the horizontal scroll bar right now, you'll notice the arrows to the right and the arrows to the left on both sides of the scroll bar, but there is no gray area and no white box in the scroll bar. When no area is showing as gray inside of the scroll bar and there's no box inside of the scroll bar, that tells you that you are viewing everything left to right that you can see. There is nothing to the left or to the right that you could see in that window. But over here on the vertical one, you can see that we have gray and we have the white box in it. That tells us there is more to be viewed. If you click on the arrow that points down in this case, it scrolls down. You can see the white box move down the scroll bar to tell us we've moved down the window area, and the icons that were on the bottom have now come into view. So you can click on the arrow, hold it down, and continue to scroll till you've seen all the contents of the window. Now the white box is on the bottom of the scroll bar. That tells us that we've gone all the way to the bottom. There is nothing more to see in that direction. All of the gray area is now above that. If we click on the arrow on the top of the vertical scroll bar and hold the mouse button down, you'll see the white box move back to the top. The gray area is now on the bottom. And with the white box all the way to the top, that tells us that there is nothing more to see in that direction. We are all the way to the top of the window. You can also click inside of the white box. This is called the elevator box. That's kind of its nickname. If you click and hold the mouse button down and drag the elevator box down the gray bar, it moves that proportion amount down the screen. As you can see, we're a little more than halfway down now. We can see the bottom half of the top icons and most of the top of the icons on the bottom, but not all of them. If we click in the gray elevator, the white elevator box, drag it down to the bottom, it's now moved all the way down, the same as holding down the arrow, but we can determine the area we'd like to scroll rather than just wait for the arrow. We can go directly to any portion of the window, halfway down, all the way down. So we can move up and down in that shaft, the elevator shaft, or the scroll bars, any way we'd like to. If we shrink the window down some more, dragging it to the left until it covers up some of the other icons, now you'll notice that we have the grayed-in scroll bar across the bottom with the white elevator box there. The arrows remain the same. That tells us there is more information to view to the left or to the right of the scroll bar of the window. Again, it operates the same way. If we click on the arrow pointing to the right, hold the mouse button down, it scrolls all the way to the right. When the elevator box is all the way to the edge to the arrow, that tells us there's nothing more to view in that direction. If we click on the arrow pointing to the left, hold the mouse button down, it scrolls all the way to the other, in this case very quickly, that tells us there is nothing more to view to the left in that window. Again, we can click in the elevator box, hold the mouse button down, and drag any amount we would like through that window. You notice they move, in this case a small window, so they don't move a great deal. But all of the windows behave that same way on the Macintosh. Let's review some of those to this point now. We can move the window by clicking and dragging in its title bar. We can click in the zoom box, zoom the window out to full size, and return it by clicking in the zoom box again to the size we had already selected. We can click in the size box, that's the lower right hand corner, hold the mouse button down and drag. The outline will show you the size the window will be when you let the mouse button up, and we can resize the window by dragging the size box to the point that we would like. If we shrink it back down, works the same way. Now we can see that we have grayed area in the scroll bars. That lets us know there is more to be viewed than we can see in this window, and we can scroll by using the arrows down, the arrows up, dragging the elevator box down or dragging it up, the arrows to the left, the arrows to the right, clicking the elevator box and dragging it to the left or to the right. There is another way to use the scroll bars. In this gray area, we have gray area to the left. We can click in the gray area one time and it will scroll one window size or screen size in that direction. In this case, that was all the way to the right. If we click on the left side now of the elevator box, the gray area is there that says it could move that direction. Click one time, it scrolls one screen or window size that direction. In this case, it's all the way to the right again, to the left. The vertical elevator shaft works the same way. We have gray area in the scroll bar underneath the elevator box. We click one time, it scrolls all the way that direction, one window size. If we click above the elevator box, it moves up one screen size, which in this case is all the way also. So it's very easy to move around, resize the windows, and use the size box to position them on the screen so that it works well for us for organizing our files and displaying the information that we'd like to on the Macintosh. Let's stretch this window back out a little bit by using the size box, and we've learned how to point, click, and drag. We've learned how to size the windows and select different items on the computer. What we need to do now is learn how to use some of the icons and the menus across the top of the screen so that we can execute many of the commands on the Macintosh. The first menu is to the upper left-hand corner of the screen. It's called the Apple menu. Now remember, to point at that means we put the very tip of the arrow or the cursor on top of that, and then we'll click to open the menu. Now to open the menu, we have to click and hold the mouse button down, and we can drag down to the first item. The first item says About the Finder, and that will give us some information about the program called Finder, which is the program that creates the desktop that you see on the Macintosh screen. Now remember, when we talk about being in the desktop or at the desktop or in the Finder, that means we can see the trash can in the lower right-hand corner of the screen and do a lot of the basic housekeeping chores on the Macintosh. When we select the command called About the Finder, another window will open up called About the Macintosh Finder, and that will give us some information about the computer and the system that we are running right now. You can see the title bar has the horizontal lines in it. That tells us that's the active window or the one in front now. Underneath we see some information about the Finder version number and the system version number. You need to be sure that you're running the proper versions of the system and Finder for your particular Macintosh. Consult your owner's manual or the updated information from Apple or your dealer or from Mac Academy and find out what versions you should have on your computer. Some other information about who wrote the particular program and the copyright from Apple. Underneath that we see the total memory that is inside of the Macintosh. Most Macintoshes come with a standard 1 megabyte of RAM memory. That's the intelligence that the computer, the place that the computer uses to store its intelligence is called RAM memory. Not to be confused with disk space. Disk space is the floppy disk that we talked about, or the hard disk drive on the Macintosh. That's where it stores the information, but all of that information is utilized inside of the computer's RAM memory, and that's where all the commands are executed in the computer. This particular computer has 2 1/2 megabytes, or 2560K of RAM memory. Typically standard, they will come with 1048K of RAM memory. Underneath that, we see 2 files are presently running inside of the computer, the one called Finder and one called System, which are instructions that tell the computer how to behave like a Macintosh. Those are contained inside of the folder called System folder. And it tells us how much of the memory available inside the computer is presently being utilized by those different programs. If we click in the close box, that will close that window, and we return to the desktop. Under the Apple menu again, we have what is called Desk Accessories. Now, the concept behind the Macintosh, and the reason we use the term desktop, is to have the computer behave as much like you do in real life as possible. And so they have used what's called the metaphor of the desktop. In other words, we place our files in folders and we put them out on the desktop in order to get our work done. Also, as with any other desktop, you have different accessories around your desk. You have maybe a clock, an appointment calendar, different items that would be available to you all the time, regardless of the work that you are doing. These are called desk accessories on the Macintosh. They reside or are available underneath the Apple menu on the Macintosh. This is called the desk accessory menu also. If you open the menu by holding the mouse button down, and the menu opens up, dragging down to the different accessories that are available. One of them is the alarm clock. You can have a clock that displays all of the time on the Macintosh. It opens up the alarm clock, and we can place that out on the screen. Now, as with other windows, even though this one is smaller, if we click inside of the window anywhere except the close box, we can drag that window around on the screen and move it to some point that you would like. We can also click in the close box, and that will put the clock away. You can set an alarm with that clock if you'd like, so at a predetermined time it'll beep at you with the Macintosh system beep. This is a standard set of Apple desk accessories under the Apple menu. If we open it again, you'll find one called Calculator. Most desks would have a calculator available to them to do some quick calculations as you do your work. Same thing with the Macintosh. Select the calculator. It brings up a basic 4-function calculator onto the screen. Again, you can click in the title area anywhere except where the close box is, and you have the calculator. You can click on the keys, and the numbers appear, and it behaves just like a regular 4-function calculator with the results there. You can also use the keys on the numerics pad for your Macintosh, and it enters the same numbers. The plus, of course, corresponds to the numerics pad. All of these keys correspond to the numerics pad on your keyboard, and so you can use the keyboard and you'll receive the results. You can leave this out on the desktop, move it around where it's not in the way of your other work, but it is available to you all the time. Or you can click in its close box. That puts the calculator away. If you ever need to get the calculator back, go to the Apple menu, open up the calculator, and it reappears on the screen, so it's available all the time. We'll click in its close box and put it away. Underneath that one, we have one called Chooser. This is a standard Apple desk accessory that allows us to choose different printers when we do the printing on the Macintosh. We select the Chooser. It takes a few seconds to look inside of the system folder, and it opens up a desk accessory called Chooser. You'll notice that there is nothing in this desk accessory at this point. The disk that we have started up the Macintosh with right now does not have any printer drivers. Those are special programs that allow the computer to communicate with different printers. None of them have been installed yet on this disk. We'll take a look at how to install those a little bit later on. Once they are, we can select different ones under the Chooser desk accessory. We'll use it again at that point. We open the desk accessory again. There's one called Control Panel. This is where you can control how different things behave on your Macintosh. It takes a few seconds to open this one up because it reads some information out of the Macintosh system folder and out of the Macintosh's memory. In the control panel, you can see it's a window, has the horizontal title bars. We can move it around on the screen if we need to. This is not typically one you would leave placed out on the desktop. It's one that you use to set up the way you want your Macintosh to behave, and then you'll close that, and you don't really get into this one very often. There are a row of icons or pictures down the left-hand side of the control panel. We can click or select one of those at a time, and then we can make some adjustments on the Macintosh. Right now the one called General is selected or clicked on, so it's highlighted. And over here we see a bunch of options that we can set. Let's take a look at the first one. There's one called Desktop Pattern. Now the desktop pattern is this area that you see out around all of the windows right now. In this case it's gray, and that's the pattern of the desktop, like a desk mat or a writing tablet you might put on your desk, and you can have ones that appear different ways. To change the desktop pattern, you'll notice that when the cursor moves across this area, it turns to a crosshair. Kind of small and hard to see sometimes, but it is. Now if you move the crosshair up into the white, what would be equivalent to the menu area, this looks like a little reduced Macintosh screen here, just like the one for the entire Macintosh screen. Into the white where would be the menu area, there's two arrows pointing different directions. If you click in the white area, you notice the desktop pattern changes underneath, and we can see over here a sample of how that pattern is designed with pixels. We can even redesign one. And nothing changed on the desktop for the Macintosh. If you move the cursor into the pattern area in the desktop pattern of the control panel and click one time, that changes the desktop screen. As you can see, some of them make things rather hard to find and aren't really very good for a desktop pattern, but you do have lots of choices. If we continue to click in the white area on either side of the two arrows, you'll notice we can scroll through a number of different patterns until we find one we like. This is the gray one that was selected prior. Let's click in the center. That turns the desktop back to a gray area. That's typically in most people's opinion, the more pleasing. It is something that is a matter of taste and opinion. You can pick whichever one you'd like. Over here on this side, you have the option of editing the desktop pattern. You can simply click where the little squares are. As you click and fill in or remove some of the dots, you can see the results over here of the pattern that would give you, and you can create whatever pattern you like best. Let's return this to just the plain gray pattern. Click there to set it on the desktop, and that remains. To the right we have an area called Rate of Insertion Point Blinking. When we type text on the Macintosh, the cursor changes from an arrow to a small vertical insertion point to let you know in most word processing programs or in working with text where it's going to insert the letters if you start typing. Well, sometimes that's hard to see on the screen if it doesn't stand out. It's just 1 pixel wide. That's one little tiny dot wide on the screen. And so we can determine how quick we would like that to flash at us to catch our attention. If we click very slow, as you can see, now you'll see a sample of how fast that would blink. You may not notice that. The one in the center is kind of an average setting. Most people will notice. If you'd like it to really stand out, you can select the button called Flash by clicking on it, and you can see that it will click much faster. Makes it easier to see. Pick whichever one is most pleasing for you. Down here we have an item called Menu Blinking. When you select a menu item, such as View or the File menu, when we select one of those items, it will blink very quickly and let you know. Now we opened that window which brought the system tools back to the front. Now remember to move our windows. We click on the window. That brings the other one back to the front. But you'll notice as I do this again, when I select Open, the highlighting of the word Open will very quickly blink 2 or 3 times. That lets you know you selected that item, and it opened the System Tools window by bringing it back to the front. Now we'll click on the Control Panel window. That brings it back to the front. This is so that you can tell which item was selected. This with the number 3 selected, you'll notice it blinked 3 times. If we click number 2, it'll blink twice. Right here you can see how many times it's going to blink as you select it. With the number 1 selected, it will only blink 1 time. If you turn that off, it doesn't blink at all. It just becomes deselected as you release the mouse button. Here again, pick whichever one makes it easiest for you to operate the Macintosh. We have one called Time, where we can set the time on the Macintosh clock. If we select any of the numbers, we'll see 2 arrows appear to the right of the time, and we've got an arrow pointing up and an arrow pointing down. If we click on the arrow pointing up, we can advance the hours in this case, or move them back. If we click on the minutes, the same thing happens with the minutes and the seconds. Click on AM, we can advance to AM or PM. It just rotates through, and you can determine whatever time is correct. Click in the clock, and that sets the Macintosh clock to that correct time. I think you should keep the clock set correctly on the Macintosh. Most of the programs on the Macintosh do use the clock, and it is maintained constantly by a battery inside of the Macintosh. So even if you turn your Macintosh off and unplug it and pack it across the country or plug it back in later on, it will still have the correct time. And most programs do use it. It ought to be set correctly. Underneath we have two buttons called 12-hour and 24-hour time. If you prefer to use military or 24-hour time, you can select that and it will show military time on the Macintosh clock. Most of us prefer 12-hour time, so I'll select that one. We have one called date underneath that. It works much like setting the clock. Click on the month or the day or the year. The arrows appear to the right where you can advance or wind them down and set the appropriate date on the Macintosh. That too should be set correctly. On the right we have a tall vertical one called speaker volume. You can click with the crosshair on the little slide and drag it all the way to the bottom. You'll notice the menu blinked at us, but the computer didn't beep. That lets you know the volume of the beep. If we slide it all the way to the top, you'll hear a small beep, and that lets you know the volume level that the computer will beep at you to give you certain messages on occasion. So you can set that at whatever level is most comfortable for you. It isn't really very loud even at its highest setting. Most people just leave it there. There's one on the bottom called RAM cache. Now we have some arrows here much like the ones for the clock and the date, and right next to the words RAM cache it says in this case 32K. That's kilobytes of RAM memory, an amount of RAM memory that's available. And you can set aside a certain amount of the computer's RAM memory for the system to use and speed up the operations on the Macintosh. If we click on the up arrow, you'll see that advances in increments, and we can wind it all the way up to have used most of the available memory on the computer. If we click on the down arrow, it sets aside smaller increments, and we can determine how much we would like to set aside in what's called the RAM cache for system use. Over here we would turn that on by clicking in the on radio button. These are called radio buttons on the Macintosh, where you have a circle, and when you click a dot appears or disappears. Now in order for this to become effective, we would have to restart the Macintosh. The amount of memory that's set aside for RAM use only happens when you start up the computer. So whatever setting is here only takes effect when you start the computer. My advice, until you're very familiar with Macintosh system operations, how the Macintosh manages memory, and how the different programs interact with the computer's memory, my advice is turn the RAM cache off by clicking off, wind it all the way down to its lowest setting, which is 32K, restart the computer to be sure that memory is cleared. If you have a 1 megabyte Macintosh, you can eat up a lot of memory for system use, and it slows down the other programs even though it speeds up the system. Not all programs like the RAM cache as well as we'd like to see either. So my advice for the most part is just leave it off until you're very familiar with it and the system operations and can determine a setting that may work best for you. Under no circumstances should you ever set it higher than 25% of the available RAM memory. But you may find with the newer programs you run out of memory quicker than you think you do. So again, my advice is turn it off. So we've set the general settings under the control panel on how we'd like the computer to behave for us. As we select other icons in the left-hand side, in this case keyboard, you'll see the information to the right of this scroll bar change, and we can determine how we would like the keyboard to behave. The key repeat rate determines how fast we would like the keys to repeat as we hold them down. The delay until repeat tells the computer how long we want to hold the key down before it starts to repeat. So depending upon how well you type or the feel you like of a different typewriter keyboard, you can determine how you'd like that to behave on your Macintosh. Set them for whatever's most comfortable for you. There's one called mouse. When we click that one, we get some information to the right of the scroll bar about how we can make the mouse behave for us. The one on top is called mouse tracking. On the far left there's one called tablet, and it says very slow. If I select that, now as I move the mouse across the screen, you'll find it moves fairly slowly, and it moves in what's called a 1-to-1 ratio. That means if we move the mouse 1 inch on the mouse pad or the desktop, it moves 1 inch across the screen. If you're doing graphics with a tablet, that might be very handy. But if you're moving around on the mouse, clicking on menus, moving around with the mouse, clicking on menus and operating the computer, that gets to be too slow for most of us. So we have the other side, from slow to fast, where we can determine how fast we'd like the mouse to move in relation to how fast we move the mouse. How fast we'd like the cursor to move in relation to how fast we move the mouse. In the fastest setting, as we move the mouse across the desktop, the cursor starts to accelerate. And the farther we move it, the faster it accelerates, and you can move around on the screen very quickly with some of the faster settings. Again, pick the one that's most comfortable for you. Underneath we have one called double click speed. We talked about double clicking as a shortcut on the Macintosh for executing a lot of the commands. We'll use even more of them later. We need to tell the computer what it should interpret as a double click versus what it should interpret as two separate clicks. And so if we click on each of the radio buttons here, there's a little picture of a mouse with a finger on it to the left, and if you click, you'll see the little mouse button highlight. There it did 2 times to tell you what it will interpret as a double click. That's a fairly slow double click. If we pick the one in the middle, you'll see it highlight twice a little bit quicker, and the one on the far right quite quickly. And so again, you determine which one is most appropriate for you so that you can double click what's comfortable and have the computer interpret that correctly. If we move down to one called sound, we'll select that one. And there are a number of items in the sound setting. We can adjust the volume here. This is the same volume that we adjusted in the general control panel setting. And normally the Macintosh gives us a simple beep, which we've heard. That's the simple beep. There are some other sounds that you can set now as part of the Macintosh system. We have the monkey. We have a boing. And we have a clank, clink, clank. So you can pick whichever one you're happiest with when the computer would beep at you. For most people, the simple beep works out the best. Now, remember what we've learned about scroll bars. This scroll bar has gray area in it. That means there is more to view. We have an arrow to the top that says we could scroll up, an arrow pointing down that says we could scroll down. The white elevator box is all the way to the top. That tells us there's nothing more to view going up, but there is more to view going down. Again, we can click on the arrow, or we can grab the elevator box and drag it down part way, or we can click in the gray area underneath and it will move down. In this case, there was only one item left. It moved all the way to the bottom. There's one called Startup Device. If we select that one, we'll notice there are no other startup devices on this computer right now. If you have more than one hard drive connected to your Macintosh, you can click in Startup Device. There will be an icon of each of the hard disk drives. You can click on the one that you would like to start up your computer whenever you turn on the Macintosh. Once we've initialized the hard drive, which we'll do shortly, then you would be able to set that if you wanted to. If there isn't more than one hard drive connected to your Macintosh with a system folder on it, it isn't going to make any difference anyway. Now we've set the items in the control panel. We can close that by clicking in the close box, and most of those items again do not take effect until you restart the computer. Continuing down, there are some others. There's one called Find File. As we move files around on the Macintosh, sometimes we lose track of where they are. With Find File, we can simply type in the name of the file and it will show us where to find those. Let's search for a file called System. So we type in the word System, click on the little icon of the person going to find it, and you'll get the beep when it searched the entire disk. And underneath we have a System folder, a little picture of a folder, and the little picture of a file called System. Now if we click on the one called System, that's the one we were looking for. Down in the lower right-hand corner, it tells us where that is. It's on the disk. Notice the disk icon called System Tools, and it's inside of, notice the icon of the folder, the System folder. So we can return to the desktop and find out exactly where that file is. There's also some other information. It tells us on the left-hand side when the file was created, the last date the file was modified, and the size or the amount of room that's eating up on the disk by being stored there. And we can close that. If we looked at the disk, we found the System folder on the disk called System Tools. Now if we were to open that, remember there's 2 ways. One is select the folder, go to the File menu and say Open, or we could have just double-clicked the folder. Inside we see more icons, and there's one called System, which is the one we just located. Now to close that window, of course, we'll click on the close box and that closes the window. Up under the desk accessories again, there's one called keycaps. We can select that one. We'll see a picture of the keyboard that's attached to our Macintosh on the screen with an area up top where the flashing insertion point is, where we could type in some information. Let's type in some words up there. And we have another menu up here on top called keycaps. We can see the different keys, their position on the keyboard. If we hold down the Shift key, we can see what we would get if we typed that particular key with the Shift key held down. If we hold down the Option key, we can see what we would get if we were to type any of those keys with the Option key held down. If you hold down the Shift and the Option key, these are labeled on the keyboard with those names, you can see different characters that you might get by holding down the Shift and the Option key. In this case, the Apple logo could be achieved by holding down the Shift and the Option key while typing the K. Under the keycaps menu, we can open that up and you can see that we have different type styles inside of the Macintosh. The one that is selected right now is one called Chicago, and the message that we typed in is in the Chicago type style, as you can see right here. If we open that and pick, say, Geneva, that's a different type style, by dragging down and selecting Geneva, you'll see the message changes to see a sample of that type style if you would prefer to use that. So we can look at all of the different type styles. Let's pick New York, and we'll see the change in the keycaps window to what New York would look like. We can also see what is on the New York type style by typing each of those keys, and again holding down the Shift key, we see what would be accomplished, holding down the Option key and the Shift and the Option key, and we find different characters in many different type styles on the Macintosh. So anytime you're in a program, want to see a sample of the different type styles and know what could be achieved to get, say, the trademark signature, that would be holding down the Option key underneath the 2. We would get a trademark. And so we can find where different characters are located that we may not be able to remember. When we close the window by clicking in the close box, the keycaps menu disappears from the menu bar also. This white area on the top of the screen is called the menu bar on the Macintosh. One last desk accessory on the standard Apple set is called Scrapbook. If you select the Scrapbook desk accessory, it opens up a window where we can see some text. There's a gray scroll bar across the bottom. Remember how they move now. We can grab the elevator box and drag it to some different point, or drag it back. We can click on the arrows. If we click one time, it usually moves one screen. Or we can click in the gray area. Click one time and it moves one screen. This has some other information down here. It says we are looking at picture number 3 out of 5, and it is a picture. If we go all the way back to the first one by grabbing the elevator box and dragging to the front, we are looking at number 1 out of 5, and this one is text. So we can store different pictures or text that you might use on letterheads or logos or for some of your artwork in the Scrapbook, and they're available at any time for any of the programs that you may be running. Let's click in its close box and close the Scrapbook. Now, before we start to take a look at the other menus across the top in the menu bar, what we want to do is initialize the hard disk. Many of you purchased a Macintosh that included a hard disk drive. We haven't really set that up yet. The Apple hard disk drives, we have to use a program to initialize them. That means get it ready for the computer to recognize information and utilize. If you purchased a hard drive from some other company, some of them already come initialized, but it's a process that you should understand a little bit from Apple. So what we're going to do is start to use actually one of the programs now. We're familiar with moving around on the desktop a little bit, so before we explore it further, let's set up to work from the hard drive. The advantage to a hard disk drive, number one, is they hold a lot more information than a floppy disk drive, so you don't run out of room near as often, and you don't have to do what's called swapping floppy disks. That means eject one floppy disk and put in another floppy disk to store or use other information. They also operate much faster. The computer can access information faster from a hard disk drive than it can from a floppy disk drive, and that makes it a lot easier a lot faster for the computer to operate and for us to utilize the programs. So let's go into the setup folder that's on the System Tools disk we have been using. Now remember how we open a folder. We can select it and go to the menu and say Open, or the shortcut, double-click the folder's icon. That opens the folder called Setup. Now there's a program in here called Apple HD SC Setup, and this is a program that we use to initialize Apple hard disk drives with. To open a program, it works just like we have been doing so far. We select its icon, that means we want to do something with this program. We can go to the File menu and open the program, or the shortcut, double-click the icon, and that does what's called launching the program, which is the same as opening the program. We can see across the menu the program was Apple HD SC Setup. We can see the screen now that tells us its version number, and it says it's going to look for an SCSI, or a SCSI device. Number 0 is the one it found, and it tells us this drive down on the bottom is uninitialized, and we need to initialize the disk. We have a button here called Initialize, so we'll click on Initialize. It tells us that this is called a dialog box on the Macintosh, and that gives us some information. This has the icon or the picture of the exclamation point to let us know this is important information. We might want to be sure we read this before we proceed any farther. Initializing will erase all of the data on this disk. Do you want to initialize this disk? That means if there had been any information there, it would be gone and we couldn't use it anymore. Since this is a brand new disk and we want to get it ready for the computer to use, we do need to initialize the disk. We have an option that says we could cancel, but we'll click on the button called Init or Initialize. Now we'll see the little circle, or the bouncing beach ball it's called, and a message on the bottom that says it's initializing the drive. The formatting is in process. This is a process that takes 3 or 4 minutes on the Macintosh to do. We can see now it's through with the initialization process, and it's presented a dialog box that says please name this volume. And we can see the letters Untitled as a default name. That means if we don't tell it any different, it will give this disk the name called Untitled. The word Untitled is already selected or highlighted. That means we can type in the name that we would like to call this disk. For now, we'll just call it Hard Disk. So we type that in on the keyboard. Use the mouse button to click OK. Down on the bottom it says it's mounting the disk. That tells us that it's busy putting the disk on the desktop so we can see its icon. It takes a few seconds to do that. And now it tells us the initialization is successfully completed. We can click on the button called Quit to quit this program. That will return us to the Finder, or remember the program is the Finder that creates the desktop, so it's also called returning to the desktop. Now the difference you'll notice as we return to the desktop, the windows are placed right where we left them, but over here on the right hand side we have another icon now. That's the icon of a hard disk drive, and it has the name that we gave the disk, which was hard disk. Let's close some of these other windows for a moment to avoid what's called window clutter. That means too many windows open and stacked up, and that makes things confusing. If we close these, let's open the hard disk window. Again, the shortcut is double click, and its window opens up. We can see the title bar, the zoom box, the close box. There's some other information that we want to talk about when we're looking at a disk window. This is the first window, or the disk window. In the left-hand corner it says 0 items. As you can see, the window is empty. The scroll bars are empty. That means there is nothing more to see, and there are no items. There is no information on this disk. In the center, we see an area called 32K in disk. As we put files on the disk, this area will change and increase. That shows us the amount of disk space that's used up by the items that are there. Now this shows 0 items and 32K in the disk. That's because a certain amount of disk memory is used in initializing the disk so that the computer can read it. Over here on the right-hand side, it tells us the amount of memory that is available on the disk remaining to be used. If we open the System Tools window now by double-clicking on it, we'll see that those same items are there. It says 4 items. We can see the 4 items in the window. 777K on the disk is what's used by those items, and 3K is still available, so there's hardly any room left to put anything else on that particular disk. Clicking on the hard disk window, of course, we can see we have lots of room left, 19 megabytes almost, to store other information. Now this hard disk won't run the computer because it has no files on there that tell the computer what to do or how to operate. Those files are called system files, and they live inside of the folder we have seen called System Folder. Right now there is one on the System Tools disk, and we can bring its window to the front by clicking on the window. Let's move it to the side a little bit by grabbing in its title bar and dragging the window, and we can see the folder called System Folder. That contains the files that the computer needs in order to operate, and that's why the System Tools disk would start up and run the computer, hence the name Startup Disk. We can copy all of the files in that folder onto the hard disk by simply dragging the folder over to the hard disk window. Now remember to drag. We click, hold the mouse button down, that selects the system folder. We drag over onto the window of the hard disk. The outline goes with us. We let the mouse button up, and we'll see a dialog box that says Files, Folders Remaining to be Copied, in this case 17. There were 17 files inside of that folder. Underneath it says it's reading and writing to the different disk names and the different file names that it found in that folder. And with the graying thermometer bar, I call those, as it changes, you can see the amount that it's copied onto the hard drive. Now when you copy a file or a folder from one disk to another disk, it does not remove it from the first disk, it places a copy on the second disk. When it's all through, that window, the dialog box goes away, and you can see we have the system folder on the disk called System Tools. If we close that window, we also now have a copy of that system folder on the disk called Hard Disk. That now contains the system instructions so that this hard disk could start up and run the computer, and we have lots of room to copy lots of different files. So let's go ahead at this point and restart the computer and explore some other options while being in the Finder or on the desktop. Basic Macintosh operations you need to be very comfortable with. In order to do that, let's use the Special menu quickly. Open the Special menu. There is an option called Restart. Now Restart will eject any floppy disks that are in the computer. It will shut down the computer, means it will clear its memory, and then it will restart the computer. In this case, it will start up from the hard drive because that now has a system folder on it, and we'll put no other floppy disks in. So we'll select Restart from the menu. The computer beeps, the floppy disk is ejected, and the computer will now restart. We see the gray screen, the smiley Macintosh, the same Welcome to Macintosh message that we saw before. And now the only icon we see on the desktop is the icon of the disk called Hard Disk. You'll notice that icon is now moved to the top position. Even though it's the only disk, it still goes to the top. The disk icon that is in the top right corner of the desktop is the disk whose system folder is in charge of the computer at the time. So you can always tell which disk is in charge of the computer. These are the system instructions on the hard drive that are presently running the computer. Let's shrink this window down a little bit, adjust its size somewhat, and you'll notice we have the gray scroll bar, and it's all the way to the bottom. And it doesn't appear that there should be anything else on that window because we haven't copied anything else there. If we click all the way to the top by clicking in the gray area, you'll notice when it reaches the top, the gray area is removed, showing there's nothing more to see. The system folder moved just a little bit. It was close enough to the title bar that it wasn't sure that it had shown everything or not. Now we can see that everything is there. Let's explore some of the other menus on the Macintosh. First of all, the File menu. The File menu, we have an option called New Folder, or a command called New Folder. When we select that, the active window, we see a new folder appear called Empty Folder. We can drag that to some other part of the window so it doesn't overlap, and we now have a folder that's empty. There's nothing in it. Its name is Empty Folder. Now, since you probably wouldn't want to leave it named Empty Folder, we can rename different items on the desktop. If we click on it, you'll notice that the cursor is shaped like an arrow when I click on it. When I drag the arrow down across the words, it changes to the I-beam, or the insertion point. Whatever text is selected now, when the insertion point is there, if I start typing, will be replaced with whatever we type. Let's just call this Folder 1. And when that now is the name of that folder, we can place it on the desktop any place we would like. Again, we're a little close to the top, so we've got gray area in the scroll bar. If we click again, that will disappear. And if we double click on the folder, it opens. There's the name folder 1. It shows there are 0 items in the folder, but it shows the amount of space that's used and still available on the entire disk. If we move its window down, you'll see that those numbers match the numbers on the hard disk window, but there are no items in folder 1. We'll close it by clicking in the close box. Click anywhere in the white area to deselect it, and we have an option called Open. Now that's available to us, and we can select Open, and it appears to do nothing. If there is no item selected, then it simply tries to bring the window that's on front back to the front. In this case, that's the hard disk window. Since it's already open, there was nothing for it to do. That's one of the times that it does give you the option for the open command, even though there isn't really anything there. Again, open we have used. We can select the folder, select the open command, and it opens the folder window. We select something, then we do something to it. So we selected the folder first. That told the Mac that's what we want to work on. Then we executed the command and told it what we wanted to do. We have one called Print that's grayed out because we can't print a folder, so the option's not available. One called Close. That will close the window or the item that is selected. We have one called Get Info. We can select this option with an item selected, in this case the folder. We'll see its icon. It says it's folder 1. We get its name. It tells us what kind it is. It is a folder. The size, how much room it's eating up on the disk. The disk that it resides on is under Where, when it was created, when it was modified, and then we have a section down here with a flashing insertion point. This is called the Get Info box, and you can type some notes that you may want to keep to yourself in there. And so you can keep some notes or some information when it was last used or when that folder was created, what version it is, anything like that. We can click in the Close to the Get Info, and those comments are saved. If we select it again, go to the File menu to Get Info, you'll find that it has saved those comments that we made for that particular item. If we select a file rather than a folder, let's open the System folder by clicking on it twice. We have a bunch of files in here called System Files. We can click on any one of those, go to Get Info, and we'll see information about the file itself. The name of it, some information about it, what kind of file it is, a system document, how much room it's eating up on the disk that it resides on, where it was created and modified, and since it's now a file rather than a folder, it will show us its version number. For most of the programs on the Macintosh, and even from other developers, now use the line called version under the Get Info box to put the current version number. And again, you can keep some notes in there if you'd like to in the Get Info box. Let's close that. Let's close again to close the System folder window. Go to the File menu, and we have Duplicate, but it's grayed because remember we haven't selected anything, so there isn't anything to duplicate. Let's return to the desktop by not selecting an option under the menu. Click on Folder 1, go to the File menu to Duplicate. Now it's available to us because we could duplicate a folder. Select the Duplicate command, and you'll see the same dialog box that said Copying Folders, and it placed another folder or a duplicate of that folder on the desktop. But you'll notice the name is Copy of Folder 1. It will not allow you to have two files or folders or documents at the same window with the same name. So it put Copy of in front. We can change the name if we would like. Again, the cursor changes to the insertion point. And this time we don't maybe want to change the whole name. We can just select part of it. And these are typical for text operations on the Macintosh. Let's click anywhere off of an icon to deselect everything. Now if we move the cursor across the icon, you'll notice it doesn't change shapes until we select the icon. Now as we move down, it changes to the insertion point. Let's click between the of and the folder. Click one time. We now have the flashing insertion point between those, and you can hit the delete key on the keyboard and backspace, and it just backspaces and gets rid of information. It wouldn't allow us to enter this name because it's the same as the other one. And we can change that. We've also got a space there prior to the F. You'll notice I can select that. An important thing on computers is to remember remember that they keep track of spaces as well as letters. Unlike typewriters where the space doesn't really count, on computers they do. So we can delete that space also. And let's just select the 1 over here by clicking and dragging through it to the right. Now we can select text that way also. Let's click in front of the F, hold the mouse button down, drag to the right. We've selected the whole name. Whatever is selected will be replaced by whatever I type. If we just want to change the number, we'll click in front of the 1, hold the mouse button down and drag across the 1. It selects only the 1, and we can just type 2. Now it's called folder 2, and we have 2 folders on the desktop, so we've duplicated one. If we open the system folder, had we selected a file, it would also make a copy or a duplicate of a file, and it would be copy of whatever that file is, just like it did the folder. We now have one called Put Away that we can't access, again because we haven't selected anything. Let's select something on the desktop, folder 2. Go to the File menu. Put Away is still not available to us because it's already put away. That means it resides where we have put it originally. Let's say we drug this folder out onto the desktop where it was easily accessible for us. Let's close the window on the hard disk to avoid window clutter, and we've been working in this folder called folder 2. Let's double click to open its window. If you've been accessing information here, now we can go to the File menu. Put Away is available because it is not placed in any window. Put it away puts the folder back into its window, but it doesn't close it for us. It just removes it from the desktop, puts it back on the hard disk window. If we close it here, it then closes the folder as well. Now if we open the window on the hard drive, it put it back away on the hard disk window for us, as you can see. We have one called Page Setup. This is where we can learn how to do some printing and how we'd like to set up the page for printing on the Macintosh. We'll select Page Setup, and we get a message right now that says the directory could not be printed because it's looking for a printer driver inside of the system folder. Well, remember, we copied the system folder over from the System Tools disk, and when we selected the chooser, we talked about installing printer drivers. We haven't done that yet. So we need to learn how to copy some printer drivers into the system folder. We'll just click OK. There's another disk that came with your Macintosh called Printing Tools disk. This contains the printer drivers. Let's put that in the floppy disk slot on the Macintosh. Its icon will show up on the screen underneath the hard disk icon. Its window's already open because it was set that way. And we have different printer drivers. LaserPrep, LaserWriter, ImageWriter, AppleTalk ImageWriter, LQ ImageWriter, LQ AppleTalk ImageWriter, LaserWriter 2 SC. We need to have the printer drivers installed in the system folder of the hard disk for any of the printers that we are going to print on with this particular Macintosh. For right now, let's just drag the one called ImageWriter over into the system folder. Now if I drag it to the hard disk window where the outline is now, it would copy it to the window just like when we copied the system folder. If I would like to place it directly in the system folder, I can move the mouse button until the cursor is over the system folder. You'll notice it highlights or becomes selected and turns black. The outline of the ImageWriter driver is on top of it. If I let the mouse button up while the folder is selected, then it will copy that program inside of the system folder. We let the mouse button up. It says there's one file that it's copying. And again, it made a copy. It left it on the Printing Tools disk. Now we can close the Printing Tools window, and we now have a printer driver inside of the system folder. Now when we go to the File menu to Page Setup, there are 3 dots behind the word Page Setup. Anytime you have 3 dots under one of the menu selections, that means there's more information that's going to come before the command is executed. So you're always safe to experiment with one of those commands because it isn't going to do anything until you go through another dialog box. The Page Setup now brings up a dialog box for the ImageWriter. Its name's in the upper left. That's the program printer driver we just copied over. Its version number over here to the right. And there are some options for printing that we can use when we print on the computer. We'll do those a little later as we create new documents in programs. For right now, we'll just click OK. That will close the information. We have another one called Print Directory. Again, the 3 dots appear after the menu. That tells us that there's more information to come before the command can be executed. We'll select that one, and we receive an ImageWriter printer box that looks fairly similar, only now we can pick some different items for how we would like the printout to be. Not just setting up the page, but how we'd like the print to come out on the computer, on the printer. We'll go ahead and cancel that for right now. If we clicked OK, it would attempt to print. Print Directory prints a graphic image of the windows that are open on the Macintosh screen. What you see on the screen is what will come out on the printer. A list of all the files and folders that you can see. There's another menu command under the File menu called Eject. Eject will eject any floppy disk that's in the Macintosh. The one that's selected right now is the one called Printing Tools. We select the Eject command. It spits out the disk, but you'll notice it leaves its grayed icon on the screen. The reason for that is many times, especially with the hard disk drive Macintosh, if you are working with more than one floppy, you may just be doing what's called a disk swap. That means we need to eject this disk for a few moments, put another disk in to work with some information, but we're not really through with this disk called Printing Tools yet. And so the computer remembers that and it may ask for it back later. If we're sure we're through with it, we can click its icon on the desktop, drag that to the trash can till the trash can turns black when the cursor moves across it, and that will trash or get rid of its icon. Now the computer knows we are completely through with that disk. It won't ask for it anymore. Let me put the disk back in and show a shortcut for that. Let me close its window by clicking in the Close box. Rather than go to the menu and executing the Eject command, that would leave its image on the screen as it did before. If we click on the disk, drag its icon to the trash, that ejects the disk and its icon at the same time, letting the computer know that we are through. It does nothing to the information on that disk, and it won't ask for it anymore. Since we've used the trash can at this point, that's one that we do want to talk about on the Macintosh desktop, is the trash can. It's one of the things the Macintosh is more famous for. The trash can is used just like a trash can would be in your office. Again, remember, the desktop metaphor means that we want the computer to behave as much like real life or like we would work on a desktop. Most people that work on a desk also have a trash can somewhere near that desk where they can dispose of things that they no longer need. Likewise on the Macintosh, if we have a file or some information that we no longer need, we put that information in the trash can. How is that accomplished? By simply dragging it to the trash. Let's take folder 2. Since we're not using that anymore, we're all through with that, we don't need the information, we can drag that folder to the trash can. Now you'll see the outline follow. When the cursor is at the top of the trash can and it becomes highlighted, if you let the mouse button up, the folder disappears from the disk window because it's been placed in the trash. Now you'll notice the trash can icon is expanded. That lets you know that there is something in the trash that is not gone yet, because like a real trash can on the Macintosh, the trash is not emptied, it's just placed in the trash can and then it's emptied later on. If we open the trash can by double-clicking its icon, you'll notice the trash window opens, folder 2 is there, we can drag it out of the trash just like you would retrieve something from the trash in your office. Now the trash can is skinny again, that lets us know that it's empty. Let's drag folder 2 into the trash. Trash can is selected. Now if we go to the Special menu, we have an option called Empty the Trash. And when we execute that command, it actually removes the information from the disk. The trash can is now empty and it's gone. There are other times the Macintosh will empty the trash on its own. If you eject the disk, the Macintosh assumes you are through with any information there and it will empty the trash if you had forgotten to do so. There are other times that it may empty the trash on its own, so the trash can is not a real good place to store information unless you're really sure you want to get rid of it, because the computer will empty the trash on its own on occasion. Otherwise, you can go back and retrieve things until the trash has been emptied. Let's move back to the desktop now and take a look at some of the other commands under there. We've been all the way through the File menu and looked at all those commands. Let's look at the Edit menu. Now most of the items under the Edit menu right now are gray. That means we can't do a lot of things with them. So we're going to open a program called Teach Text. Will allow us to work with some text and learn about the famous cut, copy, and paste that the Macintosh uses. Now as you can see on the hard disk drive, we don't have the program called Teach Text, I remember that it was on the System Tools disk that we used, so we can install it on the hard drive now. We simply take the System Tools disk, put it into the computer, open its window. Now its icon appears on the screen. Double-click its icon to open its window. We have one called Teach Text and a document it created called README, and we want to put those onto the hard disk to use them. We could operate them from the System Tools disk. They wouldn't operate quite as quickly, and if we wanted them again later on, we wouldn't want to have to go back and re-put the System Tools disk in, so we'd leave them on our hard disk drive. We can select them. Now remember how we would select them both at the same time. Let's use the selection rectangle. That means we click in the window area off of any of the icons, drag the selection rectangle until it touches both icons, any part of them, or surrounds them. Let the mouse button up. We now have selected both icons. Now we can click on one, hold the mouse button down. They remain selected. Drag them to the disk window on the hard disk. Let the mouse button up, and it will copy those two files onto the hard disk drive. Now we can close the System Tools window, eject the disk. Since we know we're completely through with this disk now, and we don't need that information at all, we can drag its icon to the trash. That ejects the disk, leaves all the information alone. That does not trash any information from the disk. And we have the files that we wanted called Teach Text and README on the desktop. Now we're going to open another program. Macintosh makes it very easy to open things. Again, the shortcut is select it and go to the File menu for Open, or double-click is the shortcut. Now we're in a program called Teach Text. This is kind of a mini word processor where we can enter some text and use the commands under the Edit menu called Cut, Copy, and Paste. Now you'll notice if I open it here, they're all gray. Remember the rule on the Macintosh: select something, then do something to it. If we haven't selected anything, there is nothing for the computer to act on, so the choices are not available. Now there is no text in this document right now, so let's create some just by typing on the keyboard. And if you can see, if you mistype or make errors, it behaves just like keyboards on other computers or typewriters. We can backspace and delete because we're in word processing right now. We're operating on text, and we can use that to go back and correct our errors. Now we've got some text in the computer. The flashing insertion point is where more text would be entered. Let's learn how we operate on text in the computer. By operate on text, I mean select and work with text. This is common to most all of the Macintosh word processors, even in the graphics programs. When we work with text, it behaves the same way. When we're on the desktop, it behaves the same way. So when we operate or work with text on the Macintosh, it's consistent throughout nearly all of the programs, so it makes it very easy to deal with. Remember, the first thing we have to do is select something. Now we have some text type. Let's learn the different ways to select text on the Macintosh. One is to click, and you'll see the flashing insertion point, and we click right in front of the M, and we can backspace and remove some text. We removed the S from the word is and the A in the spaces. Now that's where the flashing insertion point is, so if we started typing, that's where new text would appear. If we type those letters back in and the space and the A and another space, that brings the text back onto the computer as it was before. We can select words by clicking, in this case in front of the M, holding the mouse button down, and we drag through the word Macintosh. Let the mouse button up, and we have selected the entire word. In that case, we were going to do something with the word Macintosh. We can select more than one word by clicking where we'd like to start, continuing to drag, in this case all the way through the words Macintosh computer, and we've selected both words. There are shortcuts for selecting words on the Macintosh. To select one word, let's click anywhere else and deselect everything. Put the insertion point, or the I-beam cursor, this is called. Now right now you'll notice they are both there. We have the I-beam cursor over the word Macintosh and the flashing insertion point at the end of the word computer. The cursor, the I-beam cursor, is where we would click on the screen to move or do something. If we don't click to set the insertion point, it remains where it was last clicked, which would be after the word computer. So that's the difference between the I-beam and the flashing insertion point. This is the cursor, like the arrow. We're just moving that around to where we would like, only when we click someplace. Right now in front of the C on the word computer, that sets the insertion point, so that's how we move that. Let's go back and select an entire word with the shortcut. Move the I-beam cursor over the word, anywhere in the word, double-click, and it selects the entire word. So we can select entire words by double-clicking. Double-click in the word computer, it selects that word and the rest of the line. Double-click in the word this, it selects the word this. If you double-click in a word, hold the mouse button down, and drag now, it drags a word at a time rather than just one letter at a time. If you click at one point, in this case in front of the T, move the I-beam to where you'd like to stop the selection. In other words, you want to select everything in between. Now hold down the Shift key on the keyboard and click the mouse button. It selects everything in between. Now with the information selected, we can use some of the options under the Edit menu. You notice the one called Undo is gray. This program doesn't support that. Many of the Macintosh programs do. That means you can undo the last thing you did. What I want to look at first is called Cut. Now if we cut, just as its name implies, when we execute the command, whatever is selected is cut from the screen, and it's put into a special area of the Macintosh memory called the clipboard. Now the clipboard is a temporary holding place for information in the computer's RAM memory. If you were to turn the computer off, you would lose the contents of the clipboard. We can see what is on the clipboard at any time in most programs. Go under the Edit menu. The bottom command is called Show Clipboard. And when we select that, down on the bottom we can see what was put on the clipboard. We can't do anything with it here. We can just see what's there. Let's close that window. We have the flashing insertion point. Let's go back to the Edit menu, and we have only one option available to us, which is Paste. And if we click Paste, whatever we cut to the clipboard is now pasted. And it pasted it right back where it was because that's where the insertion point was. Had we wanted to paste it in some other place, we could have clicked some other place, and that's where it would have pasted the information. Now let's go back and select that again by clicking in front of the T, dragging all the way through it. Go back to the Edit menu. Now we have an option called Copy available to us. When we select Copy, it takes a copy of what was on the screen and places that information on the clipboard. Now an important thing to remember with the clipboard is it's not only a temporary holding place, but it can only hold one item at a time. Now if you remember, we cut something to the clipboard, which was the sentence. This is a Macintosh computer. We then pasted it back on. It still remained on the clipboard. As soon as we copied the new selection to the clipboard, it replaced whatever was there with whatever we did this time. In this case, it was the same sentence, so it would show the same information. But it's important to remember that it only holds one item at a time, and it is a temporary holding place. Now let's move the insertion point down a line by clicking after the period, hitting the Return key. Now the insertion point is moved down to a new line. Go to the menu. We have Paste available again. Select Paste, and we've pasted the information in. Let's hit Return again, go to the Edit menu and select Paste again, and it's pasted it again. As you can see, it remained on the clipboard, and we were able to paste it in a number of times. As long as we haven't cut anything else to the clipboard, we can continue to paste different items in different places. Let's select something again, in this case Macintosh computer. Go under the Edit menu, we have an option called Clear. Now when we select Clear, you'll see it disappear from the screen, but unlike Cut, it didn't put it to the clipboard. It just wiped it off of the screen, leaving what was already on the clipboard there. And we can go Select All under the Edit menu, and that will select everything in a given window. So now we've explored the Edit menu and learned how to operate on text or work with text, how to select words and type words with the Macintosh. Let's go ahead and quit this particular program called TeachText. Under the File menu, there's a command now called Quit. You'll notice the File menu is different here than it was when we were in the desktop, because we are now in a program and it has different options under the File menu. We'll select Quit. It will ask if we want to save any changes to the document that we just made. It isn't going to allow us to put anything away without saving any changes. We'll say no. At this point, we don't need to save that, and the information is now gone. We have returned to the desktop. So we've taken a look at the Edit menu and most of its options. The View menu allows us to view information in different ways. We'll use this a little bit later on as we start to organize files on the disk in different ways. There's one called by small icon. It reduces the icons that you see on the screen and puts the name to the right. Most of the icons become hard to read. I'm not a big fan of that view. Some people find it works well for them, however. By icon is the default view, or the way it's normally viewed. When that is selected, the icons are in their normal size with the name underneath. We can view them by name if you prefer, and that lists them alphabetically down the left-hand side and gives us some information about them to the right. If we move the window out, we can see some other information, such as when they were last modified. Under the View menu, we can go to View by Date. Then it will sort them by the date that they were last modified. We can View by Size. Now it sorts them by the largest amount of space taking up on the disk, with the folders on the bottom because it doesn't know the total size. And we can go to By Kind. And as you can see, that puts programs on top, documents underneath, folders underneath that. And we can go back to the icon view that we've been using, and it puts them back where they were. You can change from view to view at any time, and that doesn't affect how they're laid out on the desktop. It just affects how we view it at that particular time. Again, we'll use that later on as we start to organize our disk. Under the Special menu, some of these commands we have used. As you can see, the icons on the desktop are not lined up very well. There's a command called Clean Up Window. When we select that one, it lines all of the items up onto a grid. As you can see, the grid that's closest to them. Let's move this over this way a little bit and kind of make a real mess out of them. Now you'll notice that disappeared. That's a common problem that I wanted to show as we move that. As I move that item, let's move the folder and do the same thing. If we move across another folder so that it's highlighted or selected and happen to let the mouse button up inadvertently, it will put that item inside of that folder. Now we'll have to open the folder and find it to take it back out. Down here on the bottom is the Teach text. We'll just drag it back out on the hard disk window and the folder that we placed in there. In early days with the Macintosh, or early use for most people, it's very easy to inadvertently drop something into another folder. So let's line things up. Now if I just get very close and don't select the system folder, it won't drop in. It just stacks up the icons. And so we'll make kind of a mess out of this. Now we can go to the Special window, and it says Clean Up Selection rather than Clean Up Window. The reason is, if you notice the icons, we have one of them selected, so it assumes we only want to work with that one object rather than the contents of the entire window. If we go back and deselect it by clicking on it or clicking anywhere else, it now says Clean Up Window, and it moves them back into a grid. So we can just do a little housekeeping there. Empty trash is not available to us. We used that earlier when there was contents in the trash can. There is not right now, so it's not available. Erase the disk. We can erase the information from a disk that is selected on the desktop. If we select this option right now with the hard disk, the only one there, it will tell us that this is the startup disk. It's busy running the computer and you can't erase it. So it won't let you inadvertently erase the disk that's running the computer. We have one called Set Startup. There's 3 dots behind it. That tells us there's more information to follow. When we select that, we can use a program called MultiFinder or open other programs upon startup. We'll talk about that a little bit later on another tape as we start to use MultiFinder. And we have Restart, which will clear the computer's memory and restart the computer, and we have the Shutdown command. When we execute the Shutdown command, it ejects any disk, does a memory check to make sure everything's okay, brings up the dialog box that says you can now turn off the Macintosh safely. Now you would reach behind and turn off the power switch. Do not just turn it off without executing the Shutdown command. We'll restart here so that we continue a little bit farther on our computer. We need to learn some other housekeeping chores on the Macintosh. By housekeeping chores, I mean working with the disks. Copying disks, copying files, initializing disks, getting them ready to work on the Macintosh, just the basic Macintosh operations. They're accomplished at the desktop level or in the program called Finder. Let me shrink this window down so we can avoid some window clutter. And let's take a look at one of the processes we have called initializing disks. When we take a floppy disk drive that's new, there's no information on it, and the computer cannot recognize it. So what we need to do is make sure that this is organized in a manner the computer can recognize. That's called initialize, and you remember we had to do that with the hard disk. So we'll put this into the computer's floppy disk drive, and we will receive a message that says the computer cannot recognize this disk. It says this disk is unreadable. Do you want to initialize it? We have an option called eject, and we can initialize it one-sided or two-sided, and the little icon will show us which disk it's in on the computer. In this case, it's on the lower floppy disk drive. Eject would be if you put a disk in that you didn't really want to initialize by accident, and you could eject the disk if there was just some damage to it, but you knew there were good files there. You could eject it and not go through the process. One-sided is for the older Macintoshes that do not read double-sided disks. Those are the 400K diskettes. Double-sided is the newer ones that read 800K diskettes. And some of the new Macintoshes use the high density for even more information. We'll click on two-sided at this point. It tells us again this information will erase all of this process, will erase all of the information on the disk, giving you another chance to cancel in case there was something there you didn't want to lose. And we'll click on erase. Just like with the hard disk, if this disk has never been used before, it will ask us if we want to give it a name. We'll just leave it untitled at this point and click OK. It tells us it's formatting the disk. Now with a floppy disk, this only takes a few seconds, maybe up to a minute in order to organize the disk and put it into a structure that the computer can recognize. When it's through, its icon will show up on the desktop. We'll see the floppy disk icon in this case because it is a floppy disk drive, and it will be ready for the computer to use and copy and put information on. A lot of times you want to store information on floppy disks rather than your hard drive if you only access it infrequently, or if you want to make a backup so that you've got a second copy you can keep in a separate place or away from the computer. You would copy that onto a floppy disk drive. It says it's verifying the format. Once it's through with the initialization, it goes back to check the format and make sure everything's okay so that the disk is good and usable. Rule of thumb that I have found is beneficial. Occasionally when you initialize a floppy disk, it doesn't take. It says the initialization failed. Usually if it fails the first time, I throw the floppy disk away. Some people try it twice, and the second time it may take. If it doesn't take a second time, definitely don't use the disk. There's damage with it. I prefer to not even try it a second time. If it doesn't initialize the first time, I have found that later on they come back to give me problems, and I prefer to not use them. As you can see on the desktop now, we have the disk icon. The name is untitled. If we double-click to open its window, we can see that the disk is empty, and we could now copy files to the disk just like we copied them from the hard drive. We could take either of these files, in this case say the README, which is a document. We drag that across. Now we don't have to open the window, as you can see. We can just drag it across till the disk icon is highlighted. Once it is, we let the mouse button up. It will copy it onto the disk. We can copy to its icon. We don't have to have its window open. Now if we open its window, we'll find that the file is there. We can also copy a folder. And as you saw when we copied the system folder onto the hard drive, it copies all of the contents of the folder. This one didn't take very long because the folder was empty. But again, as we copy files from disk to disk, remember it leaves the original on one disk and it puts a copy onto the second disk. So we can copy back and forth file to file. We can copy folder to folder. Just to show you the process again, I'm going to move this window, shrink it down. Now I'm going to put the document called README inside of the folder called Folder 1 on the disk untitled. We do so by dragging it over until the icon turns black, let the mouse button up, and you can see it disappears, but if we open the folder, it went inside of the folder. Let's close the folder. Now I'll drag the folder back to the hard disk. I can also drag it up to the hard disk icon. Let the mouse button up, and it will ask me if I want to replace items with the same name. As you can see by canceling, we have a folder on the hard disk called Folder 1. We have a folder on the disk untitled called Folder 1. Let's open the Folder 1 on the hard disk by double-clicking. You can see there are no items in it. So let's close that. Now let's return to the disk called Untitled by clicking on its window. Drag the icon over to the hard disk window. And this time let's allow it to replace the items with the same name. Now I want you to remember we're replacing a folder with another folder. Now folders, just like folders on your desktop, hold documents. If we replace an entire folder, we replace the entire contents of that folder. Now, as you can see, we still have the copy of folder 1 on the disk untitled that contains the file called README. Let's close that window to avoid window clutter. The folder 1 that was here to the right of the system folder is now gone because it was replaced with the folder 1 that we just copied, and the file called README is there. If there had been other files inside of that other folder called folder 1, they would now be gone and just replaced with this one. If I open the folder 1 window, you'll see another attribute of names, and as we move the windows around, you will see that we have the file README on the hard disk. We also have the file called README on the hard disk inside of folder 1. They can have the same name as long as they're not in the same window. Let's go ahead and close that at this point. So we've copied files to files, and we can copy folders. We can also copy disks to disks. Let me show you how that would be done. Let's click this disk icon. Now this is a time where you'd want to use the eject command rather than dragging its icon to the trash. Because I only have one floppy disk on this machine, I want to eject the disk, but I want to leave its icon there because I'm still going to use it. So we eject the disk, it spits the disk out, its icon stays grayed so I can still access and work with the disk. I remove that. Let's take the disk called Printing Tools, put that inside of the computer so its icon shows up on the desktop. Let's close its window to avoid window clutter. Before we do, take note of the files that are there on this disk. We'll close its window. Now let's drag the disk icon to the other disk, the floppy disk called Untitled. You'll notice it selects or turns black. Once it's done so, you can let the mouse button up, and it will ask if you want to replace the entire contents. Now notice the words say, are you sure you want to completely replace contents of the disk called Untitled, that's not in any drive right now, with the contents of Printing Tools? The key to remember is we are going to completely replace the contents of Untitled with the contents of Printing Tools. If we click OK, it'll start to copy the files. It tells us it's disk to disk. It'll tell us it's reading and writing. It takes a little bit longer as we copy floppy disks. When it's read the information from that disk, it'll spit the disk called Printing Tools out, and it will ask us to reinsert the disk called Untitled. It remembers which disks it needs to work on, and in the sequence it needs to work on those. It will then write the information to those disks, the information from the disk called Printing Tools onto the disk called Untitled, but we told it to completely replace the contents. You can see it asking for the swap now, and so it will replace that folder 1 and the file called README it contained. So the caution to remember is as you copy disk to disk, it completely replaces the contents of one disk with the contents of another disk. So anything that was on the first disk would be gone. It takes a little longer to do the process when you're working with floppy disks, so we'll go ahead and hit the cancel button at this point, and we can stop the process. It has to finish the file it was busy copying, so it takes a few seconds and it goes away. If we open the disk Untitled now, we find that it stopped the process, it didn't finish, so it told us none of them is there. Even though it may have written part of it, it didn't finish the process, so it tells us that we just canceled the whole operation. But it did delete first that folder called Untitled. Let's get rid of the Printing Tools disk by dragging its icon to the trash. That tells the computer we're completely through with it now. And there is another way to copy. Let's select the floppy disk icon, drag its entire icon to the hard disk. Now when we copied from floppy to floppy, we got the message that said it was going to completely replace the contents of the disk with the other disk. If we drag a floppy disk to a hard disk, it won't allow that. It tells you that the two disks are of different types, so it cannot completely replace one with the other. So it takes the contents of the floppy disk, in this case it's called Untitled, and places them on a folder, in a folder on the hard disk, and gives the folder the same name as the floppy disk. So we tell it OK. It was a very fast process because, as we saw, the disk Untitled didn't contain anything, but we now have a folder called Untitled, and that would contain all the files that were on that disk. And that will be important as we start to copy programs onto our hard drive a little bit later on. Let's go ahead and trash this folder now. And let's eject this disk called Untitled. And let's get rid of this folder 1 we had over here. And as you can see, we've got some items in the trash now. We'll go to the special menu and empty the trash. And the trash can goes skinny. They're all gone. Let's learn how to load programs onto the hard drive. I'm going to stretch this window out just a little bit, and you'll see why it's important to know the different ways to copy. We're going to take a program called MacWrite, which is common to the Macintosh, and we'll put that disk in, new MacWrite 2. Its icon will show up on the desktop, and we'll see how to load that onto our hard drive. Now, as you can see, with its window open, it opened when the disk was inserted because it was set up that way. Let's move its window down on the bottom so we can see the hard disk window at the same time. I'm going to drag its window up a little bit. I'm even going to change the size. I'll make it long and narrow so we can pretty well see both windows at the same time. Now, from what we've learned about copying files, I could select the program MacWrite and copy that right onto the hard drive, and that one file would be copied, but that's all I would have from the program MacWrite. I likely need all of the files that came on that disk. Now, the first thing you do when you load a hard drive is open its window. If you insert the disk and its window is closed, like I just closed it, open the window first and take a look at the files that are there. One of the things you need to remember is there should never be more than one single system folder on any disk, especially your hard disk. So if this window were closed, I'll close it now, and we just drug MacWrite over to the hard disk, it will say it can't replace the entire contents, but it would put everything on the MacWrite disk on the hard drive in a folder, as we did with the disk Untitled. If there happened to be another system folder on that MacWrite disk, we would now have 2 system folders on the hard disk, and that can confuse the computer and cause problems. So let's cancel that operation. Let's open the disk first and make sure there are no other system folders. Now I have a couple of choices at this point. Since we can see there are no other system folders, I could drag the entire disk over and allow its contents to be copied into that. I may find, however, that I don't need everything on that disk, so let's click on the hard disk window. Let's ask for a new folder. It brings one out called Empty Folder. That's the default name. Let's move the cursor down to the I-beam. Remember, whatever's selected will be replaced, and let's just call this MacWrite. And we can simply select the items on the MacWrite disk now that we want. Let's say we simply want the program and its 2 dictionaries. We don't need the tutorial right now, and we don't need its hyphenation dictionary. So we'll select those 3 with a selection rectangle, drag them into the folder called MacWrite on the hard disk, and it will copy only those portions that we want. You have to think about, when you load your hard drive, the information that you need. Many of the disks that come with your computer contain other system files, and you don't want to copy other system files onto your hard drive. So open the disk window first and find out. You find that many of the others contain a lot of tutorial or sample files that you don't necessarily want on your hard drive. You may use them while you learn the program, but you don't really need them on the hard drive, so you may not copy those over, as we didn't here with the tutorial. You may find that if you did want them for a while, you could copy the entire disk over and have everything there, but you need to decide with each new program, check its manual, find out which files you need, find out that you don't want to copy any more system files over, and then determine how you want to copy them onto your hard drive. Let's open the window up now, eject the MacWrite master disk, that's the one it came with, by dragging its icon to the trash. Let's move the folder over here a little bit, go to the special menu and clean up the window. And if we open the MacWrite folder by double-clicking, we can see the 3 icons are the files that we drug over to use MacWrite. And those are organized in a folder of their own now. We can adjust the window size to suit us, the icon placement to suit us, and close its window. And we now have MacWrite installed on the hard disk drive. We can do so with each of our programs, and as we learn how to organize a little bit later on, in another tape we'll go through how to determine whether you want them in a folder or not. Well, as you can see, we've learned a great deal about the Macintosh at this point. We've learned how to point, click, and drag, which is the basic Macintosh operations that you need to be familiar with. We've also learned how to copy files and initialize disks, set up your hard disk, hook your computer all together. Practice the things that we have talked about so far. Get very comfortable using the mouse, moving the files, making everything happen on the computer. Execute the menu commands. As you first start out, don't get a lot of files and documents on your computer that you're very concerned with, so that you can experiment and try all the menu commands without risk of losing anything. When you're all through with those, go ahead and throw the files away, and then you'll be ready to start setting up and organizing your hard disk and putting the meaningful files that you'll continue to work with there. Thank you very much from Mac Academy.